Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's Dublin Festival of History event, The Civil War in Dublin, The Fight for the Irish Capital by John Dorney. The Dublin Festival of History is an annual free festival brought to you by Dublin City Council and organised by Dublin City Libraries in partnership with the Dublin City Council Culture Company. In a few moments, I'm going to hand you over to today's speaker, John Dorney. But before we start, I want to let you know that there will be time for some questions at the end of the session, and that if you would like to ask a question, you can do so by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. And for those of you talking about the event on social media, our hashtag is #HistFest21. My name is Enda, and I'm the Senior Librarian at Ballymun Library, and Ballymun Library is presenting this event to you this evening. So without further ado, let me hand you over to today's speaker, John Dorney, for the Civil War in Dublin, the fight for the Irish capital. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Enda, and thanks to all of you who are attending. Now, of course, given the times that we're living in, I can't see any of you. So for me, it's going to be like talking to myself into the computer screen, as usual in these days. But thank you all very much for attending, and hopefully we can have some good question and answer at the end. So there's Q&A function also on the screen. Now, I was thinking about giving this talk, and this talk is based on my book, The Civil War in Dublin, The Fight for the Irish Capital, which you can see here. And I was thinking about various themes that I want to develop and that I can talk about. We can talk about, for example, the idea of militarism, how when you use violence, when you use force to solve political problems, it's difficult to get it back in the bottle to stop it. That's one theme. The idea about state formation and what that involves, you know, the violence that can involve. But that's not what I'm going to do today, actually. What I'm going to do is rather, I'm going to essentially do what I was trying to do in the book, which is to tell the story of the Civil War in Dublin, which is not, I don't think, widely known even at this stage, although I think it's a little bit better known than it was when I started writing the book. The perception widely exists, I think, that the Civil War was something that happened in Dublin just at the forecourts and possibly on O'Connell Street, and then it finished. And I hope to show today that that's not the case. So what I'm going to do is essentially a conventional narrative. It's going to be a chronological narrative of the Civil War in Dublin. I'm going to try to tell the story from the start, which is the treaty split in early 1922, up until 1924, when the prisoners were released and when a mutiny in the National Army was put down. Now, that gives me a lot to cover, and I have to cover it chronologically, you know, rather than thematically. So let's dive in. This picture, as many of you will be aware, many of you will have seen, is anti-treaty volunteers in Dublin in the spring of 1922. It's marked here June, but I believe it's actually May 1922, so before the start of the Civil War. And what this is indicative of is a capital in turmoil in early 1922. After the treaty split, you have a period, it's almost like, as Lenin put it, dual power, where there's three rival armies in Dublin. What caused this? Well, the simple answer is the treaty signed on December 6, 1921, passed in the Dáil on January the 6th, a month later. Now, the treaty, whose terms I'm not going to get into in detail, of course, ended the War of Independence formally. It established the Irish Free State, or established that it would be established on December the 6th of the following year, handed over power to provisional government to oversee the transfer of power from the British authorities who were leaving. Their garrison is still here up until December 1922, but their civil and military administration is going to hand over power to this provisional government on the territory of Southern Ireland, which is established for the Government of Ireland Act 1920. Northern Ireland, of course, established then and up and running from mid-1921. Now, for our purposes, though, this really significant thing in Dublin is this causes fairly quickly, really, a very divisive and very acrimonious split in the IRA. In Dublin, this has a very particular character, which is it's in very large part a split between the IRA GHQ, the headquarters of the IRA, and the brigades, the ordinary brigades in Dublin. Let me explain. So the IRA GHQ, headed in theory actually by Richard Mulcahy, the Chief of Staff, and Michael Collins, the Director of Intelligence, although in practice Collins is the foremost personality, and the units who are closest to them. So the GHQ Intelligence Department The famous squad is known in internal IRA correspondence as the IRA Active Service Unit, and the Active Service Unit of the Dublin Brigade, so the very small full-time unit of the Dublin Brigade. All of these people who were closely directed by IRA GHQ before the truce, during the War of Independence, who are close to Mulcahy, but particularly to Michael Collins, they go pro-treaty. And their standard line was voiced actually by Tom Cullen, who was an intelligence officer: "If it's good enough for Mick, it's good enough for me." And this is, of course, a famous trope. However, in the brigades, now not unanimously by any means, but there are 4 battalions of the Dublin Brigade, 1st and 2nd on the north side, 3rd and 4th on the south side. During the truce, there's another brigade, the 2nd Brigade in South County Dublin. And there's also a Fingal Brigade, which is not so active. But of those brigades, it's only really the 2nd Brigade where the pro-treatyites are even close to being a majority. They're still roughly a minority, but due to the influence of people like Tom Ennis and so on, who are close to Collins. In the rest of the brigades, in the rest of the battalion in the brigade, first of all, the battalion leaders are all anti-treaty, and the majority of rank and file are also anti-treaty. And this is a big problem. It becomes very apparent even early on that they're going to have a serious problem in Dublin. There's a meeting with the battalion leaders early in 1922 between them and Richard Mulcahy, and they all say that they're not satisfied with the terms of the treaty. They're not satisfied essentially with the idea that they had fought for an Irish Republic, fully independent, all of Ireland. Now, I'm not going to get into the ideological stuff and so on, but the partition is something that a lot of the anti-treaty people talk about in retrospect. But at the time, the big thing is the idea of a republic, a fully independent Irish state. And they tell Mulcahy, even at an early stage, we're not satisfied with this. This contravenes our oath to the Irish Republic that we took as soldiers of the Republican Army in 1919. This gets formalized in an IRA convention. Actually, it's March 26th, the date's slightly wrong. The anti-treaty officers of the IRA, now this is not just in Dublin, this is in all of Ireland, meet in the Mansion House in Dublin, and they do 2 very significant things. They disavow the authority of the IRA GHQ, the leadership of the IRA, but also of the Dáil. So the Dáil, remember, ratified the treaty, and they elected their own executive. Now, their rationale is they are the Republican Army. They took an oath to uphold the Republic, that the second Dáil, by ratifying the treaty, had broken their oath, and that the volunteers, going back to 1914, had always had their own executive, and they were going to lead the way to the Republic, is the way they put it. Now, famously, Rory O'Connor, who's one of the foremost anti-treatyites, he's a director of engineering, but a Dublin volunteer, he emerges out of the Mansion House after this convention. He's asked by the press, what does this mean? Does this mean we're going to have a military dictatorship? And O'Connor, grumpily, I would say, says, you can take it that way if you want. Now, clearly, the anti-treatyites are in opposition. They're in defiance of the civilian government. They're also in defiance of IRA headquarters as it then existed. And so a lot of the writing in the period, and in fact the pro-treaty discourse at the time, says that these people want a military dictatorship. They weren't as organized as that. For example, Todd Andrews, who was an ardent young anti-treatyite at the time, said, I personally didn't see anything wrong with a military dictatorship, but the IRA had no such plans. They didn't have any real plan. But for our purposes, the real significant thing here is from the IRA convention, there's 2 rival IRAs, okay? There is the pro-treaty IRA, essentially, which is calling itself by this point the National Army, who first occupied a barracks in Beggars Bush in early 1922. And you have the anti-treaty IRA. The British begin evacuation. So first of all, they hand over Beggars Bush in January, which had been occupied by the auxiliaries before the truce. Then they began handing over other barracks like Portobello Barracks, today Cathal Brugha, Wellington Barracks, today Griffith College. But in April especially, this speeds up. And this increases the competition between the 2 sides. So, for example, on April the 12th, Wellington Barracks on the South Circular Road is handed over. They did it first thing in the morning, so the anti-treatyites couldn't mobilize to occupy it themselves. There had already been a very dangerous standoff in Limerick. Shots were exchanged that night at Wellington Barracks. And 2 days later, the anti-treaty elements seized the forecourts, the centre of the Irish legal system in the centre of Dublin. Also a very imposing building, of course. Gandon's Green Dome dominates the River Liffey. And the idea is this is going to be a headquarters for the executive forces, as they call themselves. So they're not going to accept, as they see it, the usurpation of the Republican Army by the National Army, by what they call the Free State Army. And so they had set up their own headquarters in Dublin. They also seized, by the way, other buildings in Dublin, including the Orange Order headquarters. At the time, there was such a thing in Dublin on Parnell Square, Fowler's Hall. They seized the Kildare Street Club on Kildare Street and various other buildings around the city. So there were clashes. There was an anti-treatyite who was killed on Grafton Street. There was shooting pretty much every night, as trade unionists complained. Now, the labour movement were very opposed to what they called militarism of both sides, and they called a general strike and protest in April. But one of the things that was said at this by a trade unionist called Richard O'Carroll was the average citizen is at the mercy of the gunmen, and they're being stopped in checkpoints. Their sleep is being disturbed by nighttime shooting and so on. And the other thing to remember is there's still the British Army here. There's 6,000 roughly British troops stationed in the barracks in and around the Phoenix Park. So they're still in what's now Collins Barracks, the Royal Barracks. They're still in the barracks in the park, Templemore, which is now, of course, the Garda Síochána headquarters, and they're still in Kilmainham in the barracks there, Richmond Barracks. Now, and this is in the mix as well. There's also an RAF squadron in Collinstown in Dublin Airport. So it's a very combustible mixture. Now, if you think about what's supposed to be happening at this point, the provisional government is supposed to be taking over power. They're supposed to be transferring the British institutions into Irish ones, in some cases making new ones, but for the most part, adopting the British ones, setting up a new police force and so on. This can't happen while the anti-treatyites are in occupation, basically, of parts of Dublin City. Now, there's a truce, or a kind of a pact, which is worked out in May between the pro and anti-treaty sides, which temporarily stops the violence. Now, by my count around the country, about 11 combatants were killed in this flare-up of April, May 1922, which means that the formal start of the Civil War is not the start of violence over the treaty. The political side of the pact says that they're going to campaign jointly in the Free States general election, which is June 1922. The military side says that there's going to be an army reunification committee to try to sort out the split in the army. And the idea behind the scenes really between Michael Collins, who's obviously the head, or not technically the head of the pro-treaty army, but in reality the head of the provisional government, and Liam Lynch, who's the chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA. The idea is they're going to get back together and they're going to do something in the north. And that kind of comes a cropper in May. But the political side also breaks down in June, because just before the treaty, just before the election, the Free State Constitution is published. Now, it had been hoped by Michael Collins that they could have a constitution that didn't mention the British monarchy, and this would have placated all but the most hard line of the anti-treatyites. Now, the British said, we're not going to tolerate that. We'll reoccupy first Dublin and then the rest of Ireland if you do that. Collins famously also gave a speech telling people not to take account of the pact, to vote for a candidate of their choice. The important point for us here is the election went ahead. There's two rival Sinn Féin parties, and the pro-treaty side won fairly decisively. So this is a pro-treaty poster. The treaty gives Ireland Parliament and so on, and Dublin Castle has fallen. So the pro-treaty argument is very nationalist. It's not at this point in any way pro-British. British bureaucracy is in the dust and so on. But the pro-treatyites win fairly decisively. Now in Dublin City, there's 16 seats, not counting 12, not counting university seats. And the anti-treaty side won only one. Now, if it hadn't been for the pact, they probably would have fought a better election. They might have won more. But the point is, in Dublin City, which is the place we're going to be talking about, anti-treaty Sinn Féin won 1. That's Sean T. O'Kelly. Pro-treaty won 10. Labour won 2, and Independents won 4. There's quite a significant feature is Independents who had been affiliated with the Home Rule Party. Alfie Byrne, for example, Lawrence O'Neill, both of whom had served as the mayor of Dublin. Lawrence O'Neill was the current head of Dublin. Now, the significance of this was the provisional government, up until then, they can just be characterised as a pro-treaty junta and so on. Anti-treatyites continue to be. But after their victory in the election, it gives them a kind of a mandate. So what are the Four Courts people to do next? Well, they're not sure what to do, really. There's a meeting of the executive, and the Four Courts faction in particular, that's, not including the Munster IRA really, want to declare war on Britain, and they want to attack British troops either in Dublin or in the north to restart hostilities. Now, Liam Lynch vetoes that in the short term, says, I don't want to do that. And so there's a split in the anti-treatyites. It looks as if, and it was the government's hope, and we know this because Dermot O'Hegarty, who's a senior figure in the government, wrote this to the British just before the Four Courts attack. It was the hope of the provisional government that the Four Courts people, through their own indecision, might be persuaded to leave the Four Courts, that they would dissolve on their own, is the way O'Hegarty puts it. But that's not what happened. So 3 events really triggered the start of the Civil War. The first one was the assassination in London of British Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. It's never been determined the allegiance of the IRA men who who shot Henry Wilson, Dunn and O'Sullivan. They certainly weren't affiliated to the forecourts, the anti-treatyites. They may conceivably have been affiliated in some way to Michael Collins and his faction, and Collins certainly looked into sending his people over to rescue them before they were hanged. It's not been clear. In any case, the British government put this together with the forecourts garrison's declaration that they were going to declare war on Britain. They formally published a declaration, and they wrote to the provisional government, to Collins, and said, essentially, if you don't attack the forecourts, we'll do it. They said Her Majesty's government feels entitled to ask under the terms of the treaty that Rory O'Connor and his arsenal, is the way they put it, can no longer be allowed to occupy the centre of the court system in central Dublin and to send emissaries out to murder in your jurisdiction, the 6 counties, the term they use, and in Great Britain. Now, this puts the provisional government, of course, in an almost impossible position, to be seen to act under British orders, or to allow the British to attack the forecourts, which would be disastrous, which would collapse the treaty. So they take an interim step, really, which is they arrest a man called Leo Henderson. Now, Leo Henderson was the head of the department, let's say, in the forecourts that was enforcing the Belfast boycott, that was stopping businesses from doing business with Belfast while attacks on Catholics and nationalists in Belfast were going on. But they'd been doing this with kind of impunity for about 2 months at this point. And Leo Henderson was surprised when he was arrested by pro-treaty troops. Now, in retaliation, the forecourts garrison kidnapped, or arrested, if you like, the pro-treaty general, J.J. Ginger O'Connell, and held him in the forecourts for Henderson's release. And they fully thought that this was what would happen, because this kind of thing had been happening since April. But instead, the government sent an ultimatum to the forecourts to surrender. And they sent an ultimatum kind of in the middle of the night to surrender, pile their arms, and come out and surrender, or face military attack. Now, it's clear it was kind of a last-minute decision. We don't really have kind of detailed minutes on how it went down. It appears Arthur Griffith was the most in favour, that Collins was possibly not as much in favour. But a force under Tom Ennis was sent out to attack the various points, actually, in Dublin held by the anti-treatyites. So they attacked Fowler Hall and various places, as well as the forecourts on the first day. Now, I'm not going to go into kind of forensic detail on the fighting that followed, because it's relatively well known compared to the rest of my story. But the forecourts surrendered after 2 days. There was, of course, a massive explosion in the Public Record Office joining the forecourts, whose fault it was is eternally debated. I mean, my take on it is simply that the anti-treatyites had been using it as a magazine. They had housed their ammunition and their explosives there, and it was set off by the shelling. And that's why it went up. So both sides bear some responsibility, but fighting continued. The rest of the Dublin brigades, the rest of the battalions mobilized around the city. And in a kind of a pale shadow of Easter week, but in nothing so well coordinated as Easter week, they occupied various points at first to try to relieve pressure on the forecourts so that they could escape. So they occupied the area of Parnell Street, where they already were, and the Upper O'Connell Street, but also areas around Stephen's Green and York Street. And there were skirmishes really around the city. Now, after the fall of the forecourts, it wasn't clear what these people were supposed to do, because originally, they really mobilized to relieve pressure on the forecourts. When the forecourts fell, there's various correspondence goes back and forward within the IRA. What do we do now? And the idea is, well, we should leave the city centre. We should resume guerrilla warfare, which is what we know. But Oscar Traynor, who was the head of the brigade, said, well, we can't do that without humiliation. So there's kind of a phased withdrawal, and there's fighting for several days. Pro-treaty troops finally relocate the artillery, which was used to shell the forecourts, relocated to O'Connell Street. There's quite hard fighting to reduce the last bit, but by the time the last buildings surrendered, and Cathal Brugha, who was the former Minister for Defence, of course, was one of the last casualties, shot in the leg, led to death. Most of the anti-treatyites had escaped. Some of them had gone to Blessington, some of them had simply gone home. But there was significant bloodshed and casualties in the first week of the Civil War. We see some of the pictures here. This is the forecourts on fire. We see the artillery shells and so on, and the breaches that they blew in the forecourts to assault it. We see an armoured car being used to shelter pro-treaty troops on O'Connell Street. And here, artillery, of course, supplied by the British garrison, Neville Macready to Emmett Dalton, who was the liaison officer. Quite significant damage was done to O'Connell Street. Ironically, this part of the street that had been spared destruction in 1916, the northeastern part particularly, was badly damaged in the Civil War. So, what was not damaged in 1916 got it in 1922. There was quite significant casualties. There was, I found 81 killed, so 29 National Army or pro-treaty soldiers 15 anti-treaty IRA, 1 British soldier. The British Army was not hugely involved, but it was involved to some degree on the pro-treaty side. And at least 36 civilians. Now, there may have been more. Those are the ones I've been able to identify by name. And around 700 anti-treaty prisoners. Now, the provisional government, it was a victory for the provisional government. But one thing I want to point out about it is what they had hoped would happen when they attacked the forecourts was that they would nip this particular extremist faction of the IRA. Remember these people who were talking about declaring war on Britain. They would nip this particular extremist faction, as they saw it, in the bud. And the rest of the anti-treaty IRA would not support them because there was this split just before the attack on the forecourts. And that the thing could be brought to a quick conclusion, that there wouldn't be a civil war. Now, that's not what happened. So Liam Lynch had actually reconciled just before the fighting in the forecourts with the forecourts garrison. The anti-treaty IRA around the country came out and supported the forecourts. And so instead of having like a limited operation in Dublin, they had a civil war. So it was a treaty, but it was a victory for the provisional government, for the pro-treaty forces. But in some ways it was a Pyrrhic one, because what they ended up with was not a minor security operation, but a civil war. Liam Lynch actually was arrested during the fighting in Dublin by Owen O'Duffy, the senior pro-treaty officer, but released because at that point in time, they thought Liam Lynch, the chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA, was a moderate. Yeah, at that point he probably was, but he certainly wasn't by the end of the Civil War. Now, my story in some ways only starts now because I want to talk about what happened in Dublin then. So the best troops and people, most of the men who had been in the squad and so on, the Dublin Guard, which was actually an amalgamation of the active service unit and the squad and the Dublin Brigade, they were sent south. They were sent in the seaborne landings to Cork and Kerry and overland operations to places like Wexford and Tipperary and so on. There was intensive recruitment among ex-soldiers. Now, for example, Collins made contact with the Royal Dublin Legion, who had headquarters in Molesworth Street. There's interesting correspondence in Mulcahy's papers showing the back and forward there, where Collins actively tried to recruit Irishmen who had served in the First World War for obvious reasons and training and so on. But ideologically, this was a tricky thing. Some of the ex-soldiers didn't get on well at all with the pro-treaty IRA contingent in the National Army. There's correspondence from the Curragh camp where the former British soldiers were sent down as instructors. And there's various reports come back about how the pro-treaty IRA men received them. They said none of them could speak any Irish, none of them had any national record, and so on like this. One of them, was threatened with death and he had to leave the Curragh and so on. So the National Army from the start was, it had kind of contradictory elements that rubbed along uneasily. Now, the anti-treaty kind of narrative would be that this was the Free State Army. It was, these mercenaries who would be in the British Army. However, the majority of recruits and the National Army went from maybe 8,000 at the start of the Civil War to 14,000 by the end of August to 55,000 by the start of the Civil War, by the end of the Civil War, sorry. So, it ballooned and most of them were unemployed. They were very young. They had no military experience, neither in the British Army, nor in the IRA, nor in anything else. The garrison of Dublin was about 3,000 for most of the Civil War. Now, as well as this, you had a kind of a plethora of what was known as the civil military forces, which makes no sense, but in theory, police, which was the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, the CDF, which was formed halfway through the Civil War, the Citizens Defence Force, the Protective Corps, which was specifically to protect ministers. Now, these were not under the command of the army, but under the Minister for Home Affairs, which for most of the Civil War was Kevin O'Higgins. Now, I'll get back to that, but within that, and within also National Army intelligence, you had a lot of men who had been senior in Collins intelligence before the Civil War. People like Liam Tobin, who was the Director of Intelligence of the National Army, and Charlie Dalton, who was very young, only 19 or 20 at this point, but who was who had been out on Bloody Sunday, for example, who had been an intelligence officer with Collins, who had been involved in a number of assassinations before the truce. Now, these people, the pro-treaty side called their forces regulars, but if there was an irregular regular, it was these guys, the CID, CDF, who were based in a place called Oriel House, which is off Westland Row. Now, as we'll see, Army Intelligence, CID, and so on became, quite feared by the anti-treaty forces by the end of the Civil War. These are some of the badges, the CID detective officers, but mostly the CID in particular was almost all ex-IRA. Now, on the other side, the people the government instructed the press to call irregulars, who saw themselves as soldiers of the Republic. This photo is a photo from County Tipperary, because apart from that photo, which I showed before of IRA men on Grafton Street, there are almost no pictures of the IRA in Dublin post the fighting of July 1922. And the reason for this is obvious. They're a clandestine organisation. But there's two brigades. There's the 1st Brigade, which is the city, and the 2nd Brigade in South County Dublin. 4 seated battalions, which is the same as before the truce. There is an active service unit, which is reformed, and it's led by a man called Bill Rowe and his brother Paddy. It's quite small, but they carry out most of the kind of concerted attacks. And later on in the Civil War, there is a part of the ASU which they nicknamed the Creasing Squad. Now, this was a bunch of ASU men. This is full-time paid. They're not paid a great deal, but they're paid roughly at the rate of a skilled tradesman, who are linked up with the intelligence department of the Anti-Treaty IRA. And later on, the idea is they're going to do the targeted assassinations. Now, that doesn't really work out for them, but the idea is there. In terms of strength, there's about 1,000 to 2,000, excuse me, at the start, minus the 700 or so taken prisoner in the first week, but there's no more than 300 at the end. Now, the main reason for this is not death. The main reason is arrest. Most of them get sent to jail. And because of this, there's a very significant role in Dublin and elsewhere in the country for women, the Women of Cumann na Man, and the Fianna, the youth organisation. The Women of Cumann na Man were the first Republican organisation to reject the treaty. They were certainly a lot of their membership left. Some of them went to Cumann na Saoirse, which was the pro-treaty equivalent. But the Cumann na Man were known for their reputation as very hardline anti-treatyites. And what women did in the Civil War was generally much more than they were asked to do during the War of Independence. Typically, they acted as quartermasters. They held the arms dumps for an IRA company or active service unit. In some cases, they participated in IRA operations. Sheila Humphreys, for example, was involved in an armed attempt to free anti-treaty prisoners from a hospital. Maura Comfort was involved in an attempt to assassinate W.T. Cosgrave, who was the head of the government at the time. And the Fianna, the young boys, were increasingly asked to replace the anti-treaty IRA volunteers who were killed or much more commonly arrested. So the youth of the anti-treatyites was often remarked upon. It was often remarked upon pejoratively that they were Trussiliers, that they hadn't fought the British, but they were fighting their own. Now, essential weakness, first of all, due to their defeat in the first week, due to their lack of a kind of coherent plan as to what they were going to do, and their lack of popular support. Now, this is true in the country as a whole, but as we've seen in Dublin, this is especially true. The sympathies of the population in Dublin are majority pro-treaty or neutral. There's a very significant part of the population that doesn't want to be involved, but the anti-treatyites and the election results of 22 and 23 both show this, are a minority. They receive another blow about a month after the fall of Dublin, or the victory of the pro-treaty forces in what's known as the Bridges job, or the Night of the Bridges. Now, pro-treaty forces at this point, this is 5th and 6th of August, were preparing to attack by sea the anti-treaty strongholds in the south in Cork and Kerry. The anti-treaty IRA hatched a plan to try to upset this by destroying all the bridges and roads leading in and out of Dublin, which would have been a significant operation. But one of the intelligence officers concerned, Liam Clark, was arrested in Rathfarnham, from where I'm talking today, and 180 anti-treaty IRA were captured. There wasn't a single pro-treaty soldier killed. There was a number injured in firefights, but almost captured without a fight. 180 anti-treaty IRA in one night. So a disaster even worse than, for example, the Customs House, the much celebrated Customs House raid of 1921. The National Army and the British Army, certainly by anti-treaty accounts, the British Army helped out with the operations on the Night of the Bridges, using armoured cars and so on. And this appeared to be the end of the Civil War in Dublin. This is the second hammer blow, if you like, at the anti-treatyites in Dublin. And also in between, there had been a number of other senior arrests. For example, Oscar Traynor, the head of the Dublin Brigade, had been arrested before that. Joe Griffin, the head of intelligence, had been arrested. There was an attempt made to arrest Harry Boland, who was a senior political and military figure, and he was shot and killed when he was arrested. Joe Griffin was arrested on that occasion. Now, this appeared to be the end of the Civil War in Dublin, but it didn't end. Why not? Well, one reason was because the anti-treaty IRA, and in particular their chief of staff, Liam Lynch, didn't accept that they had been defeated. Now, in the south of Ireland, they had lost almost all the towns and fixed positions that they had held by the middle of August. But their losses in terms of dead and in terms of capture had been relatively slight. And Liam Lynch, and he talks again and again about this in his correspondence as chief of staff of the IRA, he says, we didn't start this war. Now, I'm saying this not to endorse it, but to explain where the anti-treatyites were coming from. We didn't start this war. This war came to us. We were discussing peace and we were treacherously attacked by the provisional government on behalf of the British. Liam Lynch says we can't win this war by military means, but what we can do is wage economic warfare. We can grind down the Free State, which he calls it. We can grind down the Free State forces. We can sever kind of their ability to pay for their army by sabotaging the economic life of the country, by destroying railways and so on. We can threaten rate collectors, we can threaten tax collectors so that they can't pay for it, and force a renegotiation of the treaty. And the thing is, in August and September 1922, briefly, it looks like the Free State's victory is kind of being reversed. So Michael Collins, of course, is killed in late August 1922, but so are quite a lot of Free State soldiers in places like Kerry, Tipperary, and Cork as the guerrilla war starts, because this is what the anti-treatyites know. Now in Dublin, the anti-treatyites kind of regroup. One of the interesting things is Dan Bryan, for example, who later on is the head of Irish Army intelligence in World War II, but at the time is a junior intelligence officer in the National Army, said that the intelligence officers never capitalized on the success of the British job. So they captured nearly 200 people, they captured a whole load of paperwork and so on. They never sifted through the paperwork to figure out who was remaining, what were the structures of the anti-treaty IRA in Dublin. Said they would rather go out in raids and smash down doors and so on than do the boring job of sifting through intelligence. And as a result, the anti-treaty IRA was not smashed in Dublin, not yet anyway, and they were able to mount quite a significant kind of urban guerrilla campaign in the autumn and early winter of 1922. I'm going to come back to that actually. I want to skip on a little bit. So what we see here is a pro-treaty soldier, and he's garrisoned in a post on a rooftop in Dublin. And this is what Dublin looks like in the autumn and winter of 1922. So there are daily kind of street ambushes. Typically they're, hit and run attacks. They're using improvised grenades, which are built in workshops around the city. They're using handguns, and they're in places like the Endier Street, Camden Street area, which had been commonly used in the War of Independence as well, nicknamed the Dardanelles. They're along the Dublin Quays, where the traffic goes, on Dorset Street up into Drumcondra. So the main thoroughfares into the city, they try to attack Free State troops. They also try to attack British troops whenever they can. There's a number of kind of larger attacks. Oriel House, the head of the CID, headquarters of the CID, there's 2 attacks on it. First of all, they attempt to rush the kind of front door and they shoot a detective, but an armored car comes along and they're dispersed. The second occasion, they put a bomb in the basement of Oriel House and try to blow it up. But again, it doesn't quite come off. But they're quite concerted attacks on the head of the detective division of the Free State, or of the provisional government forces. Wellington Barracks, which was the head of the anti-treaty IRA, was the head of the pro-treaty intelligence department, and it was where prisoners were processed at the time. There was a significant attack on November the 8th, 1922, where the Anti-Treaty Active Service Unit, ASU, crept up to the rooftops on the canal overlooking the barracks and fired down with a machine gun onto the parade square where the troops were assembled for morning parade. Now, they hit 20 troops on that occasion. 2 of them were killed or mortally wounded. But, significant attacks. There were significant casualties for the National Army in this period. Now, one of the striking things about the attack on Wellington Barracks was that a quite well-armed group, it was a group of about 12 anti-treaty guerrillas, were allowed to climb onto the rooftops of this house and spray a barracks, that was doing its normal morning parade with machine gun fire. Now, had they taken proper security precautions, this should never have happened. And what was very interesting, and what you see in the paperwork, the archives of the National Army, is that things changed quite quickly in Dublin after that. So what you start seeing after that is loads of patrols every night in all the streets around barracks. So these large attacks quickly become much harder to do. So what I call it here is combat evolution, which is a modern term. So they learned by doing. The National Army was never terribly well trained, but they did hammer out kind of a rough and ready response. And in October and November, they started to again get on top of the anti-treatyites in Dublin. So there's major successes. Again, not so much, big set piece things like the British job, but the capture of Joe O'Connor, who's the head of 3rd Battalion. The 3rd Battalion is in the South Inner City. It's the most active battalion in the anti-treatyites. Joe O'Connor was a rate collector, ironically, for the government he was trying to bring down, I suppose. But he was arrested just at work. The CID just went in with guns and said, Joe, you're coming with us. Joe O'Connor was actually in Wellington Barracks when it was attacked, and he was subject to a reprisal because a soldier turned his Thompson machine gun on the prisoners who were housed in the gym, actually, of the barracks. A number were injured, but none were killed. And not long after the attack, a few days before the attack on Wellington Barracks, Ernie O'Malley, who was the head of the Eastern Division of the IRA, so the head of the IRA in Dublin, but also of the whole East Coast in theory, was arrested in a house on Aylesbury Road, and there was famously a shootout. Now, unlike most anti-treatyites, O'Malley, being the character that he was, a very combative guerrilla leader in the War of Independence, refused to surrender. He came out shouting, "No surrender here." Shot a number of soldiers, killing one, before he himself was shot multiple times and badly wounded. So there's quite a significant guerrilla campaign up until about November 1922, when the pro-treaty side again began to get on top of them. Now, I want to go back a bit. Oh, sorry. I want to go back a bit. As the pro-treaty side again get on top of the anti-treaty IRA, they amass a whole load of prisoners. So I've talked about National Army intelligence. It's a bit rough and ready. It's headed by former IRA intelligence officers. They don't have formal training in this kind of intelligence counterinsurgency. But what they do have is the sympathy basically of the civilian population, which counts for a lot. And for example, Ernie O'Malley was almost certainly betrayed by a civilian informer. But they end up also with a lot of prisoners. They end up with about 3,000 prisoners by the end of the Civil War in Dublin. And for internment, a number of things were considered. One thing that was considered was St. Helena, the island where famously Napoleon was housed in his exile. That would have required the cooperation of the Royal Navy, and so that was turned down kind of on PR grounds. The next thing the government considered was Lambay Island, the island of Howth. That was used apparently in the Jacobite War in the 1690s, and they seriously considered that, except for they found that there was no sufficient drinking water. That was in the end turned down. So they settled in the end for, as well as the prisons in and around Dublin, the internment camps at Newbridge, the Curragh and Gormanston, so internment camps around existing kind of barracks. There was also significant, several hundred prisoners housed in Mountjoy and Kilmainham. And in Mountjoy in particular, the relations were particularly violent. There was a number of riots by the prisoners, the anti-treaty prisoners, including a very significant one in November where there was an escape attempt where three Free State soldiers were killed and an anti-treaty prisoner was shot dead. There was quite regular shooting at prisoners by the anti-treaty soldiers. There was a number of civilians also killed while they were waving to prisoners. And another very significant thing that happens is this place here. This is Wellington Barracks, today Griffith College, where it's a lot less forbidding. But in those days, it's quite a feared place because it's the head of National Army intelligence up until December 1922. And this place, along with Oriel House, the head of the CID, had a really sinister reputation for the treatment of prisoners. Anti-treatyites complained of beatings, mock executions. Frank Sherwin, who was captured after the attack on Wellington Barracks, talks about being beaten with barbed wire, having a bayonet stuck in him. He lost the use of his arm from a beating. Really serious mistreatment. And the Dublin Corporation, which was majority neutral actually in composition, launched an inquiry and came back with pretty damning testimony that prisoners were systematically being mistreated. One of the prisoners was the former head of the Dáil courts, the Republican courts of the War of Independence, Dermot Crowley, who was housed in Wellington, and he himself wasn't beaten, but he said his cellmates were, and he talks about the very bad conditions. Now, this led into the media kind of war, the war about who was right, who was wrong. The press was almost entirely pro-treaty. Like O'Malley, for example, Ernie O'Malley remarks in his memoirs that there was formal censorship, but it was hardly needed because the press was majority pro-treaty. And the press was also instructed to do things like call them irregulars and so on, whereas the pro-treaty troops had to be referred to as national forces and so on. But the Republican counter-propaganda campaign, a lot of it talked about the mistreatment of prisoners and later the executions, which we'll get to. But it was limited. It was a few underground newspapers and these kind of handbills and graffiti on the street. For example, the women mostly did these thing of chalking up the streets at nighttime. And things that were written were, for example, Cromwell sent me to Barbados, but Mulcahy will send me to St. Helena, which is a reference to this government plan to send prisoners to St. Helena. They talk about the pitch cap was used in 1798, and the Free State forces are using the firing squad and so on. So most of the anti-treaty campaign goes like this, but even that is driven underground, really by the winter of 1922. There were some street protests. They mostly were about the treatment of women prisoners who started to be arrested in late 1922. They were quite regularly fired on. There was an anti-treaty supporter, I think. I don't think she was a member of Cumann na Man, Lily Bennett, who was shot dead in O'Connell Street. And there was further protests against the executions later on, which also shot at. And the role of the Catholic Church, of course. Now, I don't think the Catholic Church had quite as much. I wouldn't say they didn't have as much influence, but not quite as much influence in Dublin as elsewhere. But the Catholic Church certainly formally condemned the Republican campaign. And so this all contributed to an idea that the anti-treatyites, among the anti-treatyites, that they had no friends, but that they were going to fight on. And this is the spirit of the anti-treatyites in the autumn and winter of 1921 or 22. They're clearly losing the war, but they're not prepared to stop. And so the war only gets worse. This a just and holy war is a phrase used by Ernie O'Malley. It talks about the anti-treaty campaign, but in general, with the exception of one or two priests, like for example, the priest who started the campaign about the mistreatment of prisoners, the church was generally on the pro-treaty side. Now, the civil war appeared to be dragging on, and as it dragged on, it got more vindictive. So what you see in Dublin and what you see around the country actually is that in terms of killed in action, the majority of deaths are actually Free State soldiers. I'll break down the statistics at the end. But what you start to see, especially after the death of Michael Collins, and Collins in particular hoped to kind of patch up the Civil War even at an early stage, but he was of course killed. And the people who came after him, Mitchell Mulcahy, the chief of staff, actually held talks with him in De Valera in September 1922. But after that, that was really the last hope of a kind of an early end to the Civil War. The government was determined to crush what they saw as, by this point, a criminal conspiracy. Now, on the ground, however, the pro-treaty soldiers started to take their own revenge, I think is what's happening. For example, on August 25th, 1922, Sean Cole and Alf Colley, who were two members of the Fianna. Now, I mentioned that the Fianna were kind of actively pressed into service by the anti-treaty side, and an anti-treaty volunteer by the name of Daly were abducted in the centre of Dublin. Cole and Colley, they were young men, they were 19 or 20, I think, were taken to Yellow Lane in Whitehall. They were heard to shout apparently by passers-by, but what have we done? They were shot dead. It appears by members of either the CID and or Army Intelligence. Daly, the same thing was done somewhere near Malahide. James Stevens, Michael Neville, similarly abducted from their homes by pro-treaty forces, or it's thought anyway, pro-treaty forces, and dumped in locations around the city. Now, typically either on the north side or along the Nace Road was where bodies were dumped. The most sinister of these killings was the Red Cow killings. Now, this is a very controversial case, but these were again three teenage Fianna members. So Hughes, Holohan and Rogers were actually putting up anti-treaty posters. Now, the posters were not innocent. The posters called for the killing of what they called the murder gang, the killing of National Army intelligence officers. But they were arrested by National Army Deputy Head of Intelligence Charlie Dalton, taken to Wellington Barracks, and the following day they were found dead near a quarry in the Red Cow near the Nace Road in southwest Dublin. Now, in the early stages of the Civil War, there'd been kind of a reluctance to shoot at each other, but this was really drying up, and we were entered into a kind of addictive cycle of reprisal. People get angry at me for saying that Charlie Dalton killed these men, and it's true, I can't prove that Charlie Dalton did it, but Charlie Dalton was the arresting officer, and he was responsible for the prisoners. Now, the version that at an inquest was that they were released unharmed, and someone else had shot them. Now, I find that hard to believe. Someone in Wellington Barracks drove them to the Nace Road at Red Cow and shot them dead. Now, in total, there's around 25 unofficial killings, so-called unofficial executions in this way, targeted killings of anti-treaty Republicans in Dublin. There's an anti-treaty list, which lists members of the CID and Army Intelligence, including people like Charlie Dalton, Sean O'Connell, Frank Bolster, Joe Dolan. Though latter two, Dolan and Bolster, were also heavily implicated in kind of beating of prisoners in Wellington Barracks as well. This is Sean Cole and Alf Colley, their bodies laid out, the Fianna officers who were killed in August 1922. But that really didn't, that didn't end the campaign. Those were basically the reprisal killings, if you like, of autumn winter 1922 were really, revenge killings, I think, by Free State forces. And the government was aware that the thrust of the anti-treaty campaign was to try to bankrupt the government, to wear it down. So they felt they needed to, on the one hand, do something to halt the kind of illegal reprisals. For example, O'Higgins, who had a legal background, the Minister for Home Affairs, was very keen on this. And also to try to end the anti-treaty campaign before it bankrupted the state, or the nascent state. Kevin O'Higgins' statement, all government is ultimately based on force. So in September 1922, September 27th, so almost to the day, a few days ago, they passed the public safety legislation. Now, technically, the provisional government didn't have the right to pass legislation yet, but we'll get into the legalities. But they had a month's amnesty, and then in November 1922, they began executing anti-treaty prisoners. Now, they first of all executed 4 young men in Dublin, then 3, again, pretty much nobodies, a few days later, and then Erskine Childers. Now, Erskine Childers had been a secretary in the treaty negotiations, was a senior anti-treatyite, but you know, possibly because of his English birth and so on, or well, his Anglo-Irish kind of background, he seems to have been a particular focus of ire from the pro-treaty side. But he was executed. Now, in reprisal for that, Liam Lynch, who, remember, at the start of the Civil War was kind of tagged as a moderate, he started loosening, if you like, the restrictions on anti-treaty forces. So the murder members, this is an anti-treaty leaflet, saying that anyone who voted for the murder bill, the Public Safety Act, could be killed. Now, this led directly to the Hales assassination, the assassination of TD Sean Hales. They were actually trying to kill the speaker, the Caherlock, Deputy Caherlock rather, of the Dáil, Pádraig O'Malley. But they fired on O'Malley and Hales outside their hotel on Ormond Quay, killing Hales, wounding O'Malley. And the government responded with the execution of 4 leading anti-treatyites. Now, 3 of them were, in modern terms, no-brainers. They were head of the IRA executive, just up to the Civil War in the Four Courts garrison: Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, and Joe McKelvey of Belfast, and one other, Dick Barrett of Cork. Now, Dick Barrett was not so senior, but he had been seen centrally involved in this riot in Mountjoy, in which 3 soldiers had been killed. I suspect that's why he was identified. But one thing to point out here, as well as the kind of unofficial executions, the Mountjoy executions were entirely illegal. Why? Because the men who were being executed had been imprisoned before the public safety execution laws, which allowed for the execution of people captured bearing arms, was passed. Secondly, they were in jail at the time of the Hales assassination, so they were assassinated for something that, or excuse me, they were executed for something that they couldn't have done. And what you begin to see here is the actual body count of the Civil War in Dublin and elsewhere kind of goes down, but the status of victims changes. So instead of seeing people killed in action, you're increasingly seeing them killed in these kind of executions and reprisals. And this is really what lends the Civil War its kind of very bitter and very vindictive and very unforgiving kind of character in its last few months. The anti-treaty IRA embarked on an arson campaign. So there wasn't any more TDs killed, although, as we'll see, there was another former TD killed. But the houses of TDs and senators were burned down. The houses of pro-treaty officers were burned down. In Dublin in January and February 1923 especially, you know, there's arson attacks every night. And later on, we'll come back to this, the amusements order, where Liam Lynch declared national mourning for the anti-treaty volunteers who'd been executed, and put a ban on public entertainments. So he ordered cinemas and theatres to close. Now, we'll come back to that. But it does show that, as I said, the very vindictive and the kind of almost circular logic of the Civil War as it becomes this kind of vendetta, as a cycle of violence, if you like. On the left here, you see Sean Hales on the horse-drawn taxi, which he was riding on when he was shot. On the right is actually a pro-treaty poster from 1927, I think, and among the people that it references there is Seamus Dwyer. Now, Seamus Dwyer was a former TD, had not been elected in the 1922 election, but was head also of the CDF, which was one of these plainclothes police units, and he was assassinated in December 1922. It's thought by a young IRA volunteer called Robert Bonfield, who was a dental student in University College Dublin. And these are the anti-treaty martyrs, Rory and Liam and Dick and Joe, as the famous Republican poem goes, executed in Mountjoy on December 6th. But less known is Frank Lawler. Now, Frank Lawler has a memorial close to where I live in Milltown. Frank Lawler was abducted from a safe house in Ranelagh. He was located there by pro-treaty forces of some sort, again, most likely intelligence or CID, driven to Milltown, which was then outside the city, and shot. Now, it's thought that, and there's various testimony in the Bureau of Military History, that Lawler was shot in retaliation for the assassination of Seamus Dwyer. In fact, Lawler had nothing to do with the assassination of Seamus Dwyer, but so it goes. In early 1923, again, you have a drop in the body count, but you have more kind of indiscriminate violence, if you like. Senators' houses are burned down. In Dublin, there's quite a few of these burned down. For example, James Campbell, Lord Glenavy, who's the head of the Senate, a former unionist, but head of the Senate, his house in Kimmage was burned down. There's a very evocative description by his son in his memoir about how it was Christmas time and his mother made the anti-treatyites take the toys outside, the presents of the children, and they were, you know, they had a big pile of presents out in the garden as they're watching them burn down their house. There is a campaign against the press, so the anti-treatyites blamed the press for their what they saw as their unbalanced coverage of the Civil War. There was attacks on the Irish Independent, the Irish Times, the Freeman's Journal, and there's attempts to kill the editors. There's shooting of unarmed soldiers, which hadn't happened before. Now, in the midst of this, there is a reorganization of the National Army. Now, even though it's clear to us that by this point the pro-treaty side is winning the Civil War, it's not so clear to them. Why? Because they're losing territory and so on, battles? No, but because the Free State is slowly going bankrupt. They're building up a massive debt, and they can't seem to quash the anti-treaty campaign completely. So one of the effects of this in Dublin is the purge of army intelligence. So it's headed by these former Collins men, Charlie Dalton, Liam Tobin in particular, but also others like Tom Ennis, who's not an intelligence officer, but who's kind of attached to this group. Richard Mulcahy, who was the Chief of Staff of the National Army and also Minister for Defence, doesn't get on with these men at all. He hadn't been the kind of Collins clique before the truce. He complains that these people are not reporting to him, in his capacity as Minister and as Chief of Staff. And so he sidelines them. He sends them to kind of nothing jobs, like Dalton, for example, is made aide de camp of the Governor General. I think Tobin is put in the Air Corps, the Free State Air Corps, which is very minuscule. But the thing to note here is they don't think that the Civil War is going well. They want to reorganize. What happens is Mulcahy puts on his own men who were principally members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and this causes a great deal of infeeling within the National Army at the time. But for our purposes, the point here is they need to bring this to an end. They need to find a way of eliminating the anti-treatyites. One thing they're doing is executions to try to terrify them to come in to lay down their arms, which they could do. They could come in, lay down their arms, swear not to oppose the government, and they could go home. But the other thing is trying to improve intelligence, improved efficiency. And by gradual kind of wearing down, the bitter end does come. So by basically an enormous number of arrests, you have 12,000 odd men and women, mostly men, but there's around 300 or 400 women interned, of whom about 3,000 are from Dublin, by the way. By March and April 1922, the game is clearly up. Now, what you see in the picture here is members of the CID with a captured arms dump in the Dublin mountains. Dublin anti-treaty IRA units are increasingly hard hit by arrests. Now, there's the correspondence between the Dublin Brigade and Lynch at this period is one of great frustration on both sides. Lynch says, "Why aren't you doing the things I told you to do? Why aren't you killing ministers? Why are they allowed to patrol in the street? Why are the murder gang, the pro-treaty intelligence officers, allowed to walk the streets without being killed? Very bloodthirsty orders. Why aren't you enforcing the amusements order, the campaigning in cinemas and theatres?" And the brigade comes back, because we have no men left. They're all in jail, because we can't do barrack attacks like we did in October, November, because these intensive patrolling by the National Army. The National Army is 3,000 men. Frank Henderson, who by this point is the brigade officer commanding, so he was arrested in March. A lot of anti-treatyites on the ground say we didn't have any officers by this point. They're all in jail. We were just hiding out for fear we'd be arrested and or killed. Executions, there had been around 20 executions or so in the Dublin area up until December. But then there hadn't been any until March 1923 when they were restarted. Actually, a volunteer who had been involved in an arson campaign who had burned down an income tax office and an office worker was killed. He was executed. And so in response to that, there was 3 or 4, I think, unarmed soldiers seized and killed in Dublin. So again, more of a vendetta than a war. There was bombs planted in cinemas and theatres who were not obeying the amusements order, the ban on public entertainments. There was an anti-treaty volunteer who was shot dead trying to bomb cinema on O'Connell Street. There was an attempt to, I don't know, by the way, whose idea it was, but there was a world title boxing match held in Dublin on St. Patrick's Day, 1923. Excuse me, it says 22 there. Excuse me, it should say 23. But there was a world title boxing match held on St. Patrick's Day, 1923 in Dublin, and there's an attempt to lay a mine outside that. Now, the intention was not to kill the civilians, it was to destroy the building, but one ill-timed bomb could obviously have caused a massacre. And also in 1923, both sides by this point are killing unarmed combatants, not so much civilians, as I'll get to, but certainly unarmed combatants getting killed all the time by now. And there's a real cluster of assassinations or unofficial executions, if you like, of anti-treatyites in Dublin. Now, unlike the cluster of the previous year, this is kind of quite active anti-treatyites, and this tells me that whatever the sources were, whether they were informers or anything else or intelligence work, by this point pro-treaty intelligence had improved. They knew who these people were. So Bobby Bonfield, who was the most active kind of IRA member of 4th Battalion, which is in the south side. His friend Thomas O'Leary, Martin Hogan, who's active in the north side, I think in 1st Battalion. They're all sought at their homes. Bonfield is actually seized by W.T. Cosgrave, the Premier's bodyguard, Joe Riley. He's driven out to the Nice Road where a number of other people were killed. But there's a cluster of these killings, kind of targeted killings, we might say, in March, April 1923. By kind of early April 1923, it's really clear to all people that the game is up. Now, there's this correspondence again to the anti-treaty, in the anti-treaty side, between Liam Lynch and his director of intelligence, who by this point is a Belfast man. And Lynch says, well, you know, if we just keep going, we're going to win the Civil War. We're going to bankrupt the Free State, no matter how, no matter how difficult it is. We have to keep going. And what comes back, I think, is very kind of insightful, but also revealing of the futility of the Civil War by this point. What comes back is, as long as the Free State's credit is good, as long as the banks and ultimately the British government are willing to lend them money, they'll never go bankrupt. So this is pointless. And militarily, by this point, we can't do anything. So the active service units in Dublin, sorry, there's only one active service unit, but them and the anti-treaty units are really down to a bare bones. They've very few men, very few women. The women are increasingly employed, but very few arms. Liam Lynch himself, who refused to countenance the ceasefire, was killed in a skirmish in County Tipperary in April 1923. That was the operation was in a sense made in Dublin. Tom Derrick, who was a senior anti-treatyite, was captured and interrogated in Oriel House by the CID. Now, when I say interrogated, it gives us an idea as to how brutal this could be, because he had an eye shot out during interrogation. But probably during this interrogation or after it, Derrick seems to have revealed that the executive of the anti-treaty IRA was meeting in the Knockmealdown Mountains, and this is where Lynch was found in the sweep, and he was shot and killed. Frank Aiken took over as Chief of Staff. Aiken was much less committed to the Civil War than Lynch. He'd be much more concerned about partition than about issues of republics and oath and so on. And Aiken, under especially the influence of Eamon de Valera, issued the dump arms order at the end of April 1923, which was not surrender, because there was no negotiated end to the Civil War, but it was simply for anti-treaty volunteers to dump their arms and go home. Now, that was the end, or it was the beginning of the end of one problem. But the government also had another problem: how to get all their own state forces under control. Now, one very interesting thing you see after the IRA ceasefire and the dump arms order in April-May 1923 is there's a series of attacks on barracks, and well, shots fired anyway at barracks. And the pro-treaty reports come back saying, you know, why are there shots fired in barracks and posts around Dublin when they've just called a ceasefire? And it comes back, first of all, that it was unauthorized, that it was drunken irregulars. But later on, it comes back that it was actually their own forces who had fired in the barracks. Why? Because they were afraid of getting demobilized. Now, the demobilization process of the army and the CID and the CDF and so on is very, very fraught, because a lot of the people they want to demobilize, especially former IRA people who are the least useful in, if you like, a peacetime army, are also the most dangerous. There's continued killings. It's not clear how authorized they were, but Noel Lamass, the brother of future Taoiseach Sean, but the senior anti-treatyite, who was blamed for various things. I can get into that in questions and answers, but there was various grudges held against him by people on the pro-treaty side. Came back after the ceasefire to Dublin to see if he could get his old job back. Was picked up by pro-treaty forces, and his body was found in October 1923. Joe Bergen was a National Army soldier, but who was actually passing messages secretly from the anti-treaty prisoners to their people on the outside. He was killed by an officer called James Murray, and Murray may well have been involved in the killing of Lamass as well. And there's a number of other killings after the ceasefire. And what I call a mini pogrom, by this I mean James Slattery, who was another former squad man turned intelligence officer. Him and a number of other officers, for some reason, killed a number of Dublin Jews and shot at a number more in what appears to have been a personal dispute. So getting these people back under control is a real problem, because if they're in uniform and they're carrying weapons, they're dangerous. If you try to demobilize them, they're still going to be dangerous. In terms of the Republicans, remember, there's no negotiated end, so the government uses a kind of stick and carrot. So the correspondent says again, you know, continue raiding for arms, continue arrests, but leave their civilian side alone, which they hadn't done during the Civil War, but allow them to organize politically, allow them to take part in the election of August 1923. So as hostilities kind of ceased, a word about the civilians in Dublin. Now, what you see here in the picture is civilians who kind of came out to watch the fighting in July 1922, and it seems something that seems very surprising. It's remarked upon a lot at the time in the press and so on, that a lot of civilians were killed when they came out to watch the fighting as if it was a spectator sport. But there was violence against civilians. A lot of civilians tended to be killed in the crossfire in Dublin. There wasn't really targeted violence against civilians, though, for the most part. There were no people in Dublin killed as informers during the Civil War, whereas 15 had been killed, in sanctioned killings of informers before the truce by the Dublin IRA. The public was generally pro-treaty, as I mentioned, although there was strong neutral tendencies. Anti-treatyites often remarked, though, that there would, unlike the War of Independence, you couldn't rely on the general public. So the general public were generally hostile. There was cases where members of the public would follow IRA members and try to point them out to soldiers. After the attack on Wellington Barracks that I talked about in November 1922, members of the public, possibly relatives of soldiers, remember 20 soldiers were either killed or wounded, they attempted to attack the anti-treatyites who were captured after the attack, so echoed kind of 1916 there. But the strong neutral tendencies, and Dublin Corporation, for example, had a basically neutral stance. They repeated appeals for peace. They tried to broker talks on a number of occasions unsuccessfully, and they had an inquiry into the treatment of anti-treaty prisoners. The government took a very vindictive view of this, and also of Cork Corporation and a number of other local authorities. They closed down Dublin Corporation ostensibly, for corruption at the end of the Civil War, and it wasn't up and running again until the late 1920s. And by that point, local government was divested of a lot of its power. So the authority of local government was kind of one of the inadvertent casualties, actually, the Civil War. Another thing to bear in mind is things like industrial disputes and so on didn't halt during the Civil War. There was a strike by postal workers in September 1922. But this also was influenced by the state of the country. So there was no real police as yet. So the army was sent out to put down the postal strike. Also, the postal service was vital for the working of government at the time, and shots are fired at striking workers in September 1922. So civilians were not really deliberately targeted by either side, but they did suffer as a result of the Civil War. Now, the coda, the kind of epilogue to the Civil War, is the election of August 1922. And then there's an interesting thing happens here. So in Dublin, it's redrawn. This is it's a new system. It's the second time using proportional representation, but now there's 26 seats. And we see that there's still a pro-treaty majority in Dublin. So Cumann and Nail, the new pro-treaty party, gets 11 of the 26 seats. 5 are taken by Republicans, so significantly better than they did in the previous election in Dublin. And this is mirrored around the country, where the anti-treatyites did significantly better in the 23 election than in the 22 one. Probably this is because their support was underestimated in the 22 one because of the pact, but also to a degree, I suspect, the harshness of the government's policy, justified or not, I won't comment, during the Civil War, possibly engendered a certain sympathy among sections of the public for the anti-treaty Republicans. But another thing to draw your attention to in this is there's 6 independents and 3 in the university, which kind of don't count because they're uncontested, and 1 Labour. So there's a very significant proportion of the population in Dublin which is neutral, which is neither pro nor anti-treaty in terms of the Civil War enmities. The prisoners, however, they began to be released in summer 1923. There's a lot of correspondence goes back and forward between the government and the CID, the Detective Division, about who can be released. Prisoners can be released if they take the form, as it's known, if they swear not to bear arms against the Free State, against the government. But this is to invite the opprobrium of their own comrades. And most anti-treaty prisoners don't want to do this. So they start to release them, but there's still in and around 10,000 in prison by October, November 1923, when a hunger strike starts in Mountjoy. And eventually it's joined by around 8,000 men around the country. Now, it's in a way like the Civil War as a whole, kind of an exercise in futility, because the prisoners were going to be released anyway. It was a question of when, but they were demanding an immediate release in the hunger strike. 2 prisoners died on hunger strike, and according to Republican Rolls of Honor, at least 6 died in the aftermath. But most prisoners were released by December 1923 anyway, and the last prisoners were released by the summer of 1924. Now, the last act, and the last act of the Civil War in Dublin was the army demobilisation. Now, we talked about this now, what a fraught a process this was for the government. And what made it especially fraught was the intelligence officers. Now, remember, I talked about how these men were the men suspected of many of these unofficial so-called executions during the Civil War. Many of them had been in the IRA intelligence before the truce. They had been ousted from intelligence in 1922, late 1922, by Richard Mulcahy, and they were kind of nursing their wounds since then and nursing their grudges. Now, as demobilization approached and they weren't getting places in the army, they formed an organization called the Irish Republican Army Organization, and they talked about a mutiny and a military coup in March 1924. Now, this, as far as I'm concerned, this is sometimes dismissed. I think it was quite serious. They got in touch even with the anti-treaty side, but they, quite a few arms went missing from barracks around the country. And it was only nipped in the bud, I would say, by the actions of officers like Michael Costello, who was an intelligence officer, who was listening into their conversations, and Richard Mulcahy, who had them arrested. Now, in the aftermath, Kevin O'Higgins, who never liked Mulcahy, who saw Mulcahy as a militarist and so on, he blamed Mulcahy for this division in the pro-treaty army, and he had him ousted. He had the mutineers pardoned, and there's an army inquiry which actually inquires into Mulcahy's stewardship of the army and not the mutiny, which is odd. But for my money, it's a serious crisis which Mulcahy handled quite well. He arrested the people involved, and the talk of mutinies and military coups came to nothing. And this is the real end of the Civil War in Dublin. Now, people like O'Higgins would present it as the triumph of a rule of law, the triumph of democracy, of the will of the people. This is the pro-treaty line. You can certainly see elements of this, but as I hope I've shown, there's a great deal of kind of illegality and brutality on the pro-treaty side too, which really mars this idea of the fact that, the argument that legality is all on their side. And it's better in some ways to view it as a kind of a factional squabble, I think. For all the horror and the hatred and the long-lasting effects that came out of the Civil War, I think at the time of the Civil War, these are two fundamentally similar kind of factions who had a lethal dispute over the treaty, engaged due to a crisis that was partly outside of their making in July 1922 in a civil war, and then this cycle of violence which they find it unable to break until one side is indisputably beaten. Now, the cost, by my count, this is not final counts, and this is the count only in Dublin, so I can talk about the nation as a whole if you like in questions. The number I've found killed in Dublin is around 258. Now, that's a kind of a low estimate in the sense because it doesn't include all the accidental killings. There's at least 538 wounded. Of these, 84 are anti-treaty IRA, 95 Free State forces, mostly army, but also CID, CDF, and Civic Guard, as the Gardaí were known at the time. 72 civilians, most of whom were killed in the crossfire. At least half of whom were killed in the first week of the Civil War. 6 British Army and 1 RAC. 2 British Army soldiers were killed during the fighting of the Civil War, and 4 were assassinated before the start of the Civil War in what looks like an attempt by the Four Courts garrison to kind of provoke a response. Of the dead, this is my breakdown. Killed in KIA, killed in action, you can see considerably more Free State forces or pro-treaty forces are killed in action than IRA. Why? Because the anti-treaty IRA, first of all, are in a defensive position in this fighting that takes place in Dublin at the start of the Civil War, and afterwards it's the anti-treaty IRA who are initiating action. Now, if we look at accidents, 33 Free State soldiers. So, and this goes around the country by James Langton, who has written a book on the Free State casualties. I think the figure is nearly 300 Free State soldiers die in accidents in the Civil War, a horrendous number, around a third of the total at least. Why? Because they're generally so badly trained. As I remarked, some of them are veterans of the First World War, some of them are veterans of the IRA, but most of them are not trained at all. The Army Inquiry talks about soldiers being shown how to use a rifle on the way to the fight. The weapon safety is appalling, also motor vehicles and so on. 7 pro-treaty soldiers in Dublin were assassinated by the IRA in the sense that they were killed when they were unarmed, whereas on the other side, 25 were assassinated or killed while prisoners. Now, this looks very bad, and the pro-treaty propaganda, and I use that as a neutral term, but the pro-treaty propaganda really emphasizes this. But why is this? Well, if we look at the killed in action, a lot of it is to do with this thing of pro-treaty soldiers saying, we're standing out here as targets, you can kill us when you like, but when we capture you, you just put your hands up and surrender. Well, we're not always going to take the surrenders. And I think there are some targeted killings, strategic killings, but most of them I think are basically kind of just revenge. 2 suicides in the National Army and 1 executed for armed robbery. So at the end of the Civil War, in this demobilization period, there's a whole raft of robberies, and not all of them by any means are by the IRA. Quite a few are by demobilized soldiers. 18 anti-treatyites are officially executed in Dublin, and a number in neighbouring counties like Kildare and so on. 5 killed in accidents, so nowhere near the same number as pro-treaty soldiers, but that's because they didn't have access to arms all the time. They only picked up their arms for specific jobs. 4 of those 5 were killed laying a landmine on the next road where they blew themselves up. One died in Dublin on hunger strike, two in the country, and 4 Dublin volunteers died in imprisonment. There might be 1 or 2 more, but this gives you an idea. Now, of the civilians, 72 dead, 50 of whom were killed in the crossfire, 8 killed by Republicans in raids on houses, 1 or 2 of which might be cast as assassinations. For example, the father of W.T. Cosgrave was shot dead in his shop on Thomas Street. 13 deliberately killed by Free State forces, so more than the Republicans. Most of them were killed in things like checkpoints when they failed to stop, 1 or 2 killed in demonstrations as well. 2 civilians, including the 7-year-old son of TD Sean McGarry, were killed in arson attacks, and also an office worker. 1 civilian was also shot dead by a British soldier, apparently in a personal dispute. British forces, as I said, 1 killed in action, 3 killed before the start of the Civil War, and 1 assassinated. There's actually, that's slightly wrong, there's 1 assassinated in August 1922 as well. Now, finally, getting towards the end, the memory of the Civil War. If you go down to places like County Kerry, if you drive outside of Tralee to Ballyseedy Cross, you can see a huge memorial to the anti-treatyites who were killed there in March 1923. Now, there isn't such reminders in Dublin, but what you do see, if you look carefully, are dotted around Dublin, things like this on the left-hand side. Now, this is Martin Hogan, who was assassinated in April 1923, an anti-treatyite from Tipperary, where, by the way, he was accused of very serious crime and gang rape of a woman in early 1922. But he was assassinated by pro-treaty forces, not for that, but for his role as an anti-treaty fighter in Dublin. And these are dotted around Dublin. There might be around 20, which are maintained by the National Graves Association. There is a pro-treaty memorial in Glasnevin Cemetery around the grave of Michael Collins. But whereas Collins, due to his stature from the War of Independence, is, you know, one of the most visited graves, I think few even notice that it's surrounded by the names of pro-treaty soldiers. And what you see on the right-hand side here is something that you can't see anymore. It's the cenotaph. And this was erected in memory of Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins, the pro-treaty leaders, and later Kevin O'Higgins, who was assassinated in 1927. And like the memory, I think it's a good analogy for the memory of the Civil War. This was allowed to decay, and by the 1940s, it was in such poor repair, because, you know, it apparently hadn't been constructed of solid stone at the time. It was in such poor repair that it had to be pulled down. It was located outside of Leinster House in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, when amenities were very strong. There was parades past it and so on. But by the late 1940s, it was pulled down altogether because people simply didn't want to remember the Civil War. And what I hope to try to do today is just talk about what happened in this particular part of the country in the Civil War, so that when we talk about it, when we talk about the enmities and the hatreds and so on that came out of the Civil War, we can have some idea of why they did. Okay, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
No, John, thank you so much for that. Very informative, very interesting. We've time for just a few questions, so I'll just dive into them now.
I went a little bit over time there, ended it.
Yeah, no, you're okay. We'll get 2 or 3 questions in. It was fantastic, so don't worry about that. First question, and a few people have asked this, so but we'll try and condense it into this one question. What are the challenges facing historians in revisiting these events with the centenary of the Civil War next year?
Yeah, people always ask this, and you know, I always say that, you know, commemoration isn't our problem in a way. You know, I don't think we should get involved so much in commemoration, because commemoration is about what people think these events mean for now, right? They're about, you know, what significance they hold for now, and it's really not for us to say, you know, as historians. Like, I view my job as trying to narrate as best as possible what I think happened, and if I get it wrong, that's okay. But I can't tell people what it means for now, you know. In terms of the dangers of commemoration, though, you know, the danger, I think, really is, you know, if people want to resurrect the enmities of that time. Now, the enmities were very particular to the circumstances. I mean, I view the Civil War as something that could have been avoided. It was contingent on a lot of these events that happened at the last minute. But, you know, you can interpret Irish, you know, independent Irish history as, you know, the treachery of the Free State and so on, and the disappointed hopes of independence, and they're all bound up with the Civil War. Or you can say, you know, the pro-treaty narrative is that, you know, you have these people who have no respect for democracy, the rule of law, and you can't let them into government. And you can obviously apply that into present day politics. I don't think that's a very productive thing to do. I don't think when we're talking about the Civil War, we should enlist it for the politics of today.
Thank you. Very, very good. Next question. In both the War of Independence and Civil War, major fighting took place primarily in Munster. General Mulcahy in 1921 wrote a memo stating that Dublin was the primary theatre of war. Did the anti-treaty leaders share that view in 1922-23? And if not, why not?
Well, just in the Civil War, it's not so much concentrated in Munster. It is, I suppose if you counted up the casualties, the majority of them are in places like Cork, Kerry, Tipperary, and Limerick. But there's also very significant kind of fighting in the Civil War in Connacht, which is not true in the War of Independence. There's very significant casualties in places like Mayo and Sligo. There's also counties in which almost nothing happened in the War of Independence, like Wexford and Kildare, where there's significant numbers killed in the Civil War. That's one difference. I think the casualties of the Civil War are about the same for the 26 counties as they are in the War of Independence, actually. They're both about a bit less than 2,000. But one difference in the Civil War is that they're spread more evenly around the country. In terms of anti-treaty strategy, though, the thing is, like, the anti-treaty strategy wasn't terribly well worked out. A lot of the better strategists, for example, Mulcahy and Collins, were on the other side. Lynch had been a brigade commander and then a divisional commander in the War of Independence. How did he see Dublin? He saw, just like the War of Independence, when Mulcahy wrote that memo in 1921, what he was talking about was, for propaganda reasons, to demonstrate that the Republican government was alive and resisting repression, you had to show a presence in Dublin, you had to show Dublin was active. And the same is true of the Civil War. This is Lynch's vision. After they're driven from Dublin in the first week of the Civil War and after the Bridges job and that particular disaster, the idea is to keep up pressure in Dublin to demonstrate that, again, this is the anti-treaty perspective, the Republic is alive, they're resisting the Free State government in Dublin. That's the strategy. It doesn't really go beyond that,
Okay, thanks for that. A more specific question here for you, John. In the Four Courts, did Rory O'Connor refuse a request by Owen MacNeill and another professor to desist from using ancient files for barricades in the courts?
Yeah, there's a great polemic over this, and this is again the polemical Civil War stuff. So, Owen MacNeill, first of all, didn't go down. That's a legend. There's a legend that Owen MacNeill went down and asked him not to occupy the Public Records Office. It's the Public Record Office which adjoins the Four Courts on its western side. He may have sent some sort of message. He didn't go down and ask him in person. The thing about the public records is there was various kind of discourse in the 1990s by people like Tom Garvin and so on. This was an act of cultural vandalism and so on. And certainly the anti-treatyites stored their explosives and munitions in the Public Record Office. So when it was attacked, it was obviously going to be highly unstable. But the charge is that they blew it up deliberately as they were surrendering the place. And I don't think that's true, because what happened was the pro-treatyites made their first breach in the complex. They stormed into the Public Record Office. And the anti-treatyites by this point had retreated into the complex. They didn't have kind of remote timers like you might have now for explosives. And what I think is the fire that went off, that was raging in the building by that point, set off the explosives. There was the first explosion then, which actually caused the complex to surrender, so it wasn't to the anti-treatyites' advantage. And then as they were being marched away, there's a second explosion which destroyed it completely. And for my money, all it is the place is on fire because it's been under bombardment for 2 days. And that set off this store of explosives. So the anti-treatyites bear responsibility for storing their explosives there. The pro-treatyites, because they bombarded the place. So, take your pick. But that's my very boring conclusion on the Public Record Office.
No, very interesting. Thanks for that. Okay, I'll get 2 more in, John, please. John, you say the British participated in the Night of the Bridges in August when 180 anti-treaty were captured. But beyond that, were the British confined to barracks before evacuation?
No, not in Dublin. They weren't. No, they were doing basically what American military calls these days force protection. So like they had a garrison in Dublin, and they're in the west of the city primarily, in and around Kilmainham, in the various barracks there, and they're in Collinstown today, Dublin Airport. And they have to do various things, like they have to go in and get food and so on. So they're doing kind of armed patrols up until December 1922. They're visible presence in the city, and the anti-treatyites do try to attack them on a number of occasions. They throw bombs at them when they fire at them. They fire shots at their barracks. They didn't succeed in killing any, except for one guy in Merrion Square who was visiting his father, apparently was shot. But one interesting thing is the assassination of Sean Hales, which is December 6th, 1922. The forces that were first on the scene were actually British forces. So a British armored car was passing by and they fired some shots at the assassins. The assassins were led by an intelligence officer called Owen Donnelly. But, you know, that shows British forces were active in the city up until their evacuation, which was December 17th, 1922. But up until that, they were doing armed patrols kind of throughout the city. And they weren't in most of the country, but they were also down in the treaty ports in the south, in Cove and Berehaven, and they were involved in a number of kind of actions there. But they tried not to be actively involved in the Civil War. They tried to just kind of protect their forces as much as possible. Neville Macready, their commander, was very cognizant of the fact that it was what the anti-treaty want is for us to intervene so that, you know, the treaty split might be healed. That's what the anti-treaty thought might happen. And Macready said, I definitely don't want that to happen. You know?
Okay. No, thanks for that. Now we'll just do two more, if you don't mind, John.
Yeah, as many as you can, yeah.
How important, in your view, was the Republican position taken by the majority of Cumann na mBan as distinct from Cumann na saoirse?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, you know, the role of women in the Civil War is kind of really interesting, and we need to look at it more because one thing that you see in the pro-treaty, both government and military, is that they actually blame these women for the Civil War, and they'd say things like they're not real women, you know, they're fanatics and they're hysterical and so on, you know, and there's no reasoning with them. But the kind of legend, though, is that like all the women were anti-treaty. But what happened was the leadership of Cumann na mBan was almost, you know, mostly anti-treaty. They forced out the ones who weren't. They went to Cumann na saoirse, people like Jenny Weiss Power and so on. But the membership of Cumann na mBan actually dwindled. So what you find is, you know, the activist minority retains the organization, but the majority of members just fall by the wayside, whether they're neutral or pro-treaty. You know, you'd have to really research in detail. But basically, it's a bit like the IRA. The majority of the IRA is anti-treaty too, but like it's the activist core. You know, it doesn't necessarily represent even all of the Cumann na mBan members before the truce, let alone all the women in the country. However, having said that, and just a quick caveat is that there is this thing of like all over the country, not just in Dublin, but in places like, you know, in Mayo and Cork and Kerry, pro-treaty, it's the women are the problem. The women are the problem. They're keeping this going. And I'm not exactly sure what's going on there, but it is very interesting. I think we need to look more into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then finally, just to say thank you, folks, for all your comments and all your good wishes to John. Thank you for that. Just with one final question. John, can you say something about the contribution made by the overseas IRA expeditionary forces sent to Dublin by the Scottish Brigade and the Liverpool Company in July 1922?
Yeah, expeditionary forces might be a bit too grand a term, but okay. There's an interesting thing here. The IRA in Britain, a lot of them were actually arrested and interned in Britain, or arrested and imprisoned one way or the other, for actions before the truce, right? So they were involved in a big arson campaign in Liverpool, for example, and in London. A lot of them were deported to Ireland, but the majority of them, and this is actually echoes the experience of Northern volunteers as well from Northern Ireland, a lot of them joined the National Army, the pro-treaty army. So you might have expected them to be more extreme or something like that, but it's not the case. People like Jonathan Pinkman and so on, Paddy Lowe, people who were involved in the pro-treaty forces in Dublin are from the Liverpool IRA. The Scots, I'm not so sure about. Tommy Tormey, a friend of mine, has researched that in more detail than me. But there's also halfway through the Civil War, there's I think 600. That might be too many, but like there's a significant number of IRA volunteers from Britain who were deported in the middle of the Civil War back to Ireland. And as far as I know, the majority of them were pro-treaty, and a number of the pro-treaty soldiers who were killed in Dublin were actually from Liverpool. Like I can think of two offhand: Paddy Lowe and Tony Dean. Tony Dean was a detective in the CID, actually.
Okay, thanks for that, John. I'm just going to sign off now, and I'd like to thank John for his fascinating and comprehensive and detailed account of the Civil War in Dublin. And I'd like to thank Sophie from the Dublin City Council Culture Company for her technical support, and everyone who took part in today's Dublin's Festival of History event run by Dublin City Council. You can find out more about other upcoming festival events at the Dublin Festival of History.ie website and on Dublin City Libraries social media channels. I hope you enjoyed today's event. Again, I want to thank John. I'd like to thank you for your attendance and for your questions and your comments. I hope you enjoyed it and that we'll see you at more events during the festival. Goodbye. Good night. Stay safe. Thanks, folks. Thanks, John.